Have you ever wondered why great empires collapse? The Roman Empire controlled enormous territories, commanded powerful armies, and built roads that still exist today. The Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in history. The Ottoman Empire survived for centuries. The Maya built sophisticated cities, monuments, and systems of writing. These civilizations looked almost unstoppable while they were at their peak, and yet every one of them eventually weakened. Some disappeared slowly, others collapsed with shocking speed. We usually imagine an empire falling because an enemy army invaded its borders, but that explanation misses something much more important. Empires rarely collapse because of one single event. They collapse when several weaknesses begin reinforcing each other. At the beginning, successful empires usually have the opposite problem. They're growing. New territory brings new farmland, new resources, new trade routes, and new taxpayers. Victories create confidence. Confidence attracts more soldiers and more investment. More territory produces more wealth, and more wealth allows rulers to build stronger armies. This creates a powerful cycle of expansion. But expansion also creates a hidden problem. Every new piece of territory has to be controlled. Roads have to be maintained. Soldiers have to be paid. Officials have to be appointed. Borders have to be defended. The empire becomes larger, but the cost of keeping it together becomes larger too. Imagine an empire expanding across an enormous map. At first, every victory adds wealth, but eventually the army has to travel thousands of kilometers just to reach a distant frontier. Messages take weeks or months to arrive. A local governor becomes powerful simply because the central government is too far away to watch everything. The empire may still look strong from the outside, while control is quietly weakening from within. Distance is one of the oldest enemies of political power. Then comes the problem of money. Large empires require enormous amounts of revenue. Soldiers need salaries, roads need repairs, fortifications need supplies, governments need administrators. When economic growth slows, rulers have difficult choices. They can raise taxes, borrow money, reduce spending, or change the currency. Each solution has consequences. Raise taxes too much, and ordinary people become angry. Cut military spending, and enemies may become more dangerous. Borrow too heavily, and future governments inherit the burden. Weaken the currency, and people may lose confidence in the economy. This is why economic problems can become political problems surprisingly quickly. A farmer doesn't necessarily care about complicated financial theory, but if taxes rise while harvests become worse, that farmer feels the crisis directly. If merchants lose confidence in the currency, trade becomes more difficult. If workers cannot afford basic necessities, unrest increases. Economic pressure doesn't automatically destroy an empire, but it can weaken the loyalty that holds an empire together. And then there is inequality. Almost every large civilization creates differences in wealth and power. Some inequality can exist without destroying political stability. The danger appears when people begin believing the system is permanently designed to benefit only a small group. When elites accumulate more land, wealth, and political influence, ordinary citizens may become less willing to defend the institutions that created that inequality. A society can remain wealthy while becoming politically fragile. History gives us many examples of powerful elites competing with one another while the larger population struggles. Instead of solving external problems, political leaders become focused on gaining control over the government itself. Elections, court politics, succession disputes, and rival factions can become more important than the long-term health of the empire. When leaders spend more energy fighting each other than solving problems, the state becomes weaker even if its army remains powerful. Another dangerous factor is corruption. Corruption isn't simply about individuals taking money illegally. In a large empire, corruption can become structural. Officials may begin serving themselves instead of the institutions they represent. Government contracts can become opportunities for private wealth. Positions can be sold. Taxes collected from distant provinces may never reach the central government. Every corrupt transaction seems small, but millions of small failures can gradually damage the entire system. Then comes the problem of succession. A powerful ruler can hide weaknesses for decades, but what happens when that ruler dies? If there's a clear and accepted method of transferring power, the empire can survive. If there isn't, everything can become unstable. Rival generals may compete for the throne. Political factions may support different heirs. Civil wars can consume enormous resources. And sometimes the empire weakens itself so badly that an outside enemy doesn't need to conquer it. The empire has already done most of the damage itself. Climate can make these problems worse. Ancient societies depended heavily on predictable rainfall, rivers, and agricultural seasons. A prolonged drought could reduce harvests, increase food prices, and force people to migrate. Floods could destroy settlements and infrastructure. Changes in temperature could affect crops and livestock. Climate alone rarely explains the collapse of an empire, but environmental stress can act like pressure on a system that is already struggling.
Disease is another hidden force. Large cities create enormous advantages because people, goods, and ideas can move quickly, but the same networks can move pathogens. A disease spreading through a densely populated city can kill workers, soldiers, farmers, and administrators at the same time. That can reduce tax revenue, disrupt trade, weaken armies, and create panic. The very connectivity that made an empire powerful can become a vulnerability during a major epidemic. Now imagine all of these problems happening together. Tax pressure increases, food production falls, political factions fight, corruption grows, the army becomes expensive, a disease spreads through cities, a neighboring enemy becomes stronger. None of these problems alone necessarily destroys an empire, but they interact. Economic weakness makes military defense harder. Military weakness encourages rebellions. Rebellions reduce tax revenue. Lower revenue makes the army weaker. Political instability makes economic recovery more difficult. The system enters a feedback loop. This is one of the most important ideas for understanding collapse. Collapse is often not a straight line downward. It is a cycle. A problem creates another problem, which creates another, until the system reaches a point where recovery becomes extremely difficult. The Roman Empire is a useful example, although its history was far more complicated than the simple story of one sudden fall. Rome experienced political instability, civil wars, economic pressures, military challenges, demographic changes, and enormous administrative costs. The western part of the empire eventually fragmented in the 5th century, but the Roman world didn't simply disappear. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for almost another 1,000 years. This reminds us that an empire can transform rather than simply vanish. The same lesson appears elsewhere. The Mongol Empire expanded with extraordinary speed, but governing such an enormous territory created challenges. Different regions developed their own political identities, and the empire eventually divided into separate khanates. The Ottoman Empire survived for centuries, adapting to enormous changes in warfare, trade, technology, and international politics, before finally disappearing after the First World War. Collapse is therefore not always a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it is fragmentation, sometimes transformation, sometimes gradual loss of power. The Maya offer another fascinating example. Many Maya cities experienced severe political and demographic changes during periods of environmental stress and warfare, but Maya civilization itself did not simply disappear. Maya communities survived, adapted, and continue to exist today. What collapsed were particular political systems and urban centers. This distinction matters because history often describes civilizations as if entire populations simply disappeared. Usually, people remain. Governments change. So perhaps the biggest mistake we make is thinking that empires collapse because they become weak. In reality, many empires remain incredibly powerful, even during their final centuries. The deeper problem is that the system becomes less capable of responding to new conditions. A successful empire is good at doing what worked yesterday. A resilient empire is good at changing when yesterday's solutions stop working. That difference can determine survival. Technology can change the balance of power. New trade routes can make old economic centers less important. New weapons can make traditional armies less effective. New religions or political ideas can challenge existing institutions. Populations can move. Climate can shift. Disease can spread. The world around an empire never stops changing. The most dangerous sentence a civilization can believe is probably this: "This is how we have always done it," because history rewards adaptation. Look at the modern world. We no longer live under ancient empires, but many of the same pressures still exist. Governments depend on economic stability. Institutions depend on public trust. Infrastructure requires maintenance. Political systems need peaceful transfers of power. Societies must adapt to technological change, demographic shifts, environmental pressures, and unexpected crises. The lesson isn't that modern countries are destined to collapse. History doesn't work like a countdown clock. The lesson is that no political system is automatically permanent. Power has to be maintained. Institutions have to be repaired. Trust has to be rebuilt. And problems have to be addressed before they become interconnected crises. Empires don't usually die on the day their final capital is captured. The visible ending is often just the final chapter of a much longer story. The real collapse may have begun decades earlier, when people stopped trusting institutions, when governments became less adaptable, when economic pressure increased, when political competition became destructive, or when leaders ignored problems because the system still looked strong from the outside. That may be the most important lesson hidden inside the ruins of ancient civilizations. A civilization doesn't become fragile because it has problems. Every civilization has problems. It becomes fragile when it loses the ability to solve them. And that is why the ruins of ancient empires are more than monuments to the past. They are records of experiments in human organization. They show us what happens when cooperation works, what happens when institutions fail, and what happens when a system becomes too rigid to adapt. The greatest empires in history were not destroyed simply because someone stronger appeared at their borders. They were tested by change. Some adapted, some transformed, some fragmented, and some collapsed. But the pattern remains remarkably consistent. The greatest threat to a civilization is rarely a single enemy. It is the moment when many small weaknesses begin working together. Because an empire can survive a war, it can survive a bad harvest, it can survive a corrupt leader, it can survive a financial crisis. But when several of these problems arrive at the same time, the question changes. The question is no longer whether the empire is powerful. The question becomes whether it is flexible enough to survive. And throughout human history, that may be the real difference between civilizations that endure and civilizations that become ruins.